Ambassador Freeman, could you share some of what your experience was like joining Nixon's trip to China?
In many ways, the Nixon visit to China was exactly what I had joined the Foreign Service to participate in. I had no idea I was going to be on the trip myself, but I was locked up in the operations center at the Department of State, and I'm told I wrote almost 50% of the briefing papers for the trip. It was a surprise to me when baggage tags were shoved through the mail slot at my house, and I learned that I was to be on the trip. Obviously, a moment like this, which is everyone participating in it saw it as an historical moment, turned out to be much greater than any of us imagined. It began a process which, by fits and starts, produced not just the normalization of US-China relations, but China's entry into the world order as a full participant, and the opening of China to a variety of Western influences by Deng Xiaoping, who very carefully used the new opening to the United States in 1979 and afterwards to change China in ways that he thought would make it more successful and productive. And they turned out to do that. So this was a moment in which history changed. The world went through an inflection. China, which had been sidelined for almost 250 years anyway, and victimized by external powers, gradually resumed its role as the most populous and one of the wealthiest societies on the planet. But we had no inkling of this whatsoever. My first impression of Shanghai at the airport was that there were no airplanes. The birds were singing. This is not what you expect at an airport. And when we arrived in Beijing, we found a capital that was obviously very tightly buttoned up for security purposes, but which was backward, impoverished, intellectually isolated, and really very different from any other spot on the planet. So this was a China that was weak, isolated, impoverished, and at the time undergoing the Cultural Revolution, which was a spasm of revolutionary fervor that did huge damage to China and its image abroad. And all these things have been reversed. So it's very hard at this point, 50 years later, to capture an accurate impression of what things looked like in 1972 in February.
Were there added difficulties arranging this trip, especially given the many prior years of distance between Washington and Beijing?
Well, yes, the advance did not go particularly smoothly because the White House advance people had come out of the campaign and were accustomed to shoving people in Peoria and other places around, and Beijing was not Peoria. So there was some friction there. The presence of a very large press group was a novel thing. We had to install Earth satellite stations for television broadcasts. The Chinese were not hooked into any system. The telephone systems were not connected. In fact, at one point, I was asked to call Guam, where the aircraft to take us home were waiting, and asked the White House operator, either the Chinese operator, to do that. The Chinese operator connected us to an operator in San Francisco who adamantly insisted that Guam was not part of the United States, whereas the Chinese said it absolutely is part of the United States, and you can put me through. And eventually, of course, that somebody who did know that Guam was part of the United States enabled this call to go through. So there were certainly instances like this.
What was it like arriving in Beijing and then assuming your duties as interpreter?
I think there were some members of the party who didn't understand China, who were somewhat taken aback at the austerity of the greeting. There were no girls with pom-poms and dancing children, but Joe and I appeared with great dignity, and Nixon, looking to repair the slight that John Foster Dulles had offered to Joe 20 years before by refusing to shake his hand, the group then went into the airport, which was a tiny airport. It's the sort of thing that you would find in a small town, not the huge, busy airport of today. Actually, there's several airports now. And so we sat down, and there was a brief sort of like social chit chat between Joe and Nixon. Nobody told me what to do, so I just sat in the back and monitored the interpreting, which was accurate. Of course, none of us had experienced at that point, other than Kissinger, who does not speak Chinese, Wayne Lord, who does not speak Chinese. Nobody had, other than John Holdridge, had ever observed the Chinese interpreters in action. And they were very competent, and that was very reassuring. I had learned Mandarin, Putonghua, in Taiwan. While I had a Beijing accent, because my teachers were from old Beijing, vocabulary was somewhat different. And I had made an effort to discover and adjust to mainland vocabulary, but of course I'd never been on the mainland. So inevitably there were instances where vocabulary was out of line. And there were also ideological problems with vocabulary. The most notable one to me was an argument I ended up having with the Chinese interpreter over how to express the concept of deterrence. And she used a word which implied a sort of active menace and no reassurance to the other side, which is not accurate. And it took the Chinese actually 30 years, the Chinese military Academy of Military Sciences has finally come up with a neutral and very accurate word for deterrence, shuzhe, which is menace, and halt, which is a pretty good definition of deterrence. But there were these sorts of differences. And I found it all very, very interesting. Of course, I was jet lagged out of my mind and tired from the strain of interpreting, which is a very intensive experience, challenges your memory, and not probably best done when you are jet lagged. Anyway, it all worked out.
Can you describe what the process of negotiations was like during the trip?
The way these summit meetings are usually structured, and this one was, is that the foreign minister, in this case, William Rogers, who was the former attorney general and crony of President Nixon with no real expertise in foreign affairs. The foreign ministers, William Rogers and the acting foreign minister in China, who was Chi Pengfei, a veterinarian who specialized in the care of mules, they were assigned the task of discussing everything we disagreed about. And it was important to do that because both of us had friends and allies who needed to be reassured that we had not abandoned them or betrayed them or negotiated behind their back about issues of supreme importance to them. So I was the interpreter for that set of talks, while the chiefs of state and government the president and Zhou Enlai talked about pleasant things they'd seen and done, and the wonderful prospects before us if we could set aside the differences that we were reaffirming and proceed to pursue common interests. In Chinese, this is called 求同存异, to look for common ground while reserving differences. And that was the spirit of these meetings. The Shanghai Communique fully reflected the structure and content of the talks. It began with a lengthy recitation of very sharp differences between the United States and China on issues like the wars in Indochina, Vietnam War, Korea, Kashmir, and other matters. And this was essential, as I said, to reassure our respective allies and friends that we had not given ground on the issues of greatest concern to them. But it then went on, and I should say this was done at the suggestion of Zhou Enlai, was very wise and very unusual. Usually diplomatic documents paper over differences. This one accentuated them. Having done so, the communique proceeded to the nub, which was to say that notwithstanding all the foregoing differences, we recognized, and notwithstanding the differences in our socioeconomic systems, ideologies, and history, we recognized the benefits to both of us of cooperating to oppose hegemonism, meaning essentially Soviet expansionism, but in the eyes of the Chinese, also recalling Japanese effort to impose hegemony on Asia. With that affirmation that we could compartmentalize cooperation and separate it from differences, we then went on to try to finesse the Taiwan issue for the moment. And that was not as hard as it might have seemed. Both Taipei and Beijing took exactly the same position. Each claimed to be the government of all of China. Both said there was only one China and that Taiwan was part of it. So the United States simply said we did not challenge their joint position, or their common position, I should say. And then, with an eye to a possible peaceful resolution of the Chinese Civil War between these two parties, we said that as tensions in the area diminished, we would progressively withdraw our military forces and installations from Taiwan. So this enabled us to finesse that, and we went on, the communique then went on to affirm that there would be value in both sides pursuing economic and cultural exchange, trade and cultural exchange. That was essentially the communique, and almost all of this, the wording had been worked out over preceding months. The one real issue to be resolved, which was discussed between Nixon and Zhou Enlai, was the precise formula on Taiwan. Now, there too, there had been previous work. The United States and China conducted 136 talks at the ambassadorial level, first in Geneva and then in Warsaw. And in the final Warsaw talk, the United States proposed essentially the do not challenge formula on Taiwan, and also suggested that we would send an emissary to Beijing. I was pulled out of language training. I had hoped to be the Taiwanese language officer in Taipei and had spent a lot of time learning Taiwanese as well as Mandarin, and actually had begun learning Hakka when I was yanked out to come back to the China desk at State and write papers for a purpose that was not explicitly revealed to me, but which I knew from having read the record of the Warsaw talks, was the preparation for the special emissary to Beijing. I did not know that would be Henry Kissinger. The way this worked was interesting bureaucratically. I wrote papers, others did too, but as I say, I wrote almost half, and they would be bootlegged to the National Security Council staff, which consisted of John Holdridge and Dick Solomon. In those days, the NSC was a lean and effective organization, unlike the bloated mess that it now is. So these documents did not go through the regular channel. They were not reviewed by higher authority at the State Department. In effect, Henry Kissinger, working on preparation for this trip, had co-opted a small group of people in the China desk. So that is how I ended up, as I said, in the operations center, actually writing the briefing book for, or portions of the briefing book for the president, and at the last minute, Mrs. Nixon. And I was fortunate in that I had a copy of Nagel's Guide to China, which was wonderful on the scenery of the sorts of sites she was likely to visit, and cultural and artistic stuff that I plagiarized freely from Nagel's. And so I'm grateful to the publishers and hereby thank them.
The Shanghai Communique was issued at the end of the trip. Did the negotiations take the full week?
Well, normally a communique of this sort is issued at the end of the visit, but there were the Taiwan section, as I mentioned, which was the crucial thing to be resolved, was not resolved until our visit to Hangzhou before we went to Shanghai. When we arrived in Shanghai, the communique, which had been negotiated in English, was shown to me with Ji Chaozhou and I think probably maybe John Hanzhou was there, I'm not sure. But anyway, Ambassador Ji, who was a Harvard student who went back on a ship to China during the Korean War when patriotic Chinese were called to duty and Americans were being extremely unkind to Chinese. G showed me the communique. I read it with great interest in Chinese, comparing the English, and was very pleasantly surprised to find once again that the Chinese interpreters had done a very professional job and had very nicely covered the nuances of the English. I think I made one or two suggestions and asked a question, but basic, I think the suggestions were accepted and the question was well answered. And so I think it passed muster as a linguistic document. And I think from a diplomatic point of view, as I mentioned, it was innovative in its style with a sharp recitation of differences followed by a statement of common purposes. And it was clearly historic. Frankly, if we look at the situation today, there's a great deal to learn from it. First, be forthright about your differences. Don't hide them. But second, put cooperation first before differences. Cooperation on matters of common concern, whether it's through joint action or coordinated parallel actions that serve the same end, is the gain that you get from diplomatic relations. Differences are things to be resolved over time. Unfortunately, at the moment, we seem to have put adversarial antagonism ahead of cooperation. That is a mistake. So we could learn from this incident in statecraft, and it is worth reviewing the communique in that light.
Was there any feeling while there that the trip and the Shanghai Communique would hold so much importance 50 years later?
No, I don't think so. This was a step toward normal relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. You must recall the weirdness of this visit consisted of the fact that while Nixon was visiting what people in Taipei, which we recognized as the seat of government for all of China, were people in Taipei called that the bogus regime. He was talking to the bogus regime while we continued to recognize the Republic of China with its capital in Taipei and had an embassy there. And this was a step toward switching relations and recognition, which did not happen for another 7 years or 6 or 7 years because of political upheavals in both countries. In the United States, Watergate occurred. Nixon had said that in his next term, his second term, he would normalize with Beijing, but he didn't have a full second term. And Gerald Ford, who succeeded him, Vice President Ford, who succeeded him, did not have the political clout to address such a controversial issue. On the Chinese side, shortly after this visit, Deng Xiaoping was released from incarceration. The Cultural Revolution seemed to be subsiding. But then there was a relapse in the form of the ascendancy of the Gang of Four. And it wasn't until the late 70s that Deng was able to return to prominence and actually become the paramount leader in China. And of course, in 1978, while Leonard Woodcock and State Roy were negotiating the normalization communique in Beijing, the two things happened. The third plenum of the 11th Party Congress approved Deng Xiaoping's radical program for reform, and in effect, the reversal of most of the political system, economic system that China had borrowed from the Soviet Union, as well as some elements of Maoism. And then almost immediately after that, normalization occurred. And the two things were connected. Deng really wanted to time normalization for two purposes. One was he felt he needed to halt Vietnam's cooperation with the Soviet Union in encircling China by building a Vietnamese empire in Southeast Asia. So he wanted to, as he put it, administer a curriculum to Vietnam to teach it that it could not do that at reasonable cost. And in order to do that, he needed to have the appearance of American backing to keep the Soviet Union at bay. And he achieved that with normalization. But far more important and not known to us at the time was his intent, as I said earlier, to use the United States to change China, to make it part of the broader world rather than a poor imitation of a failing Soviet Union.
Earlier, you touched on some of the difficulties of being an interpreter. What were some of the other challenges you faced?
Well, the first, of course, was not being told what I was to do. I was asked to interpret the president's banquet speech and told there was no text, which was a lie because I had written the text. And I ended up disobeying a presidential order to interpret because of that lie. Eventually, the president apologized to me with tears in his eyes. But I was 27, and I was sure that my diplomatic career had come to a dramatic end. So that was something that was quite interesting. Second, we accomplished the geopolitical purpose that I had foreseen when I joined the Foreign Service by bringing China into a relationship with the United States and enlisting it, in effect, in the containment of the Soviet Union. But there were so many other issues left hanging. All of the debris of the break in relations, the 2 decades of estrangement, and non-communication were there to be fixed. And so while I left Shanghai, like everyone else on the trip, the bully, enthusiastic, we had accomplished our purposes and done it fairly skillfully. I was very aware that there was going to be an awful lot of picking up after the trip to do. And indeed, that was the case. But that's another story.